Fall asleep as Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. Chapter 1. Before the Sun. I awoke well before the light, not to a horn or shout, but to silence. A king sleeps lightly in war. My body ached from days in the saddle, nights under damp cloth. I lay still in the darkness of my tent, surrounded by the cold breath of October, wrapped tightly in a heavy woolen cloak lined with fox. The muffled sounds of sleeping men and snorting horses drifted beyond the canvas. A candle stub burned low in the corner. Outside, the camp was quiet, almost sacred. It was St. Crispin's Day. The hours before dawn were mine alone, a time for prayer, for preparation. The world was still cloaked in fog and frost. I sat up, pulling boots over aching feet, and poured water into a bronze basin. It was cold enough to sting. I splashed my face and whispered the Lord's Prayer, repeating the words slowly, like iron links in a chain I could hold to steady my heart. I paused for a moment, letting the silence envelop me again. In that quiet, I could hear the distant sounds of life beginning, horses shifting in their lines, the occasional clink of steel, the soft murmur of a dreamer waking. I thought of my mother, Mary de Bohun, long gone from this world. Would she have feared for me today? Would she have prayed for my soul the night before a battle like this? A shadow moved across the canvas of my tent. My manservant, Owen, entered without speaking, bringing a fresh linen shirt and my prayer book. He bowed and laid them carefully beside me. I nodded my thanks, and he slipped back into the dark beyond the flap. There was no need for words between us this morning. I picked up the prayer book and opened to a psalm I knew by heart. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. As I read, I felt the weight of the crown upon me, not of gold, but of duty. I thought of England, not as a nation of lines on a map, but as the rolling hills of Gloucestershire, the bells of Canterbury, the bustling ports of Southampton. I thought of the people, the ones who would never know my face, but who prayed for me nonetheless. From my tent I could hear the low rustle of squires rising. They moved quietly, knowing the weight of the day. My armour was laid out already, each piece polished, each strap inspected. I touched the breastplate reverently before dressing. The mail shirt dragged heavily across my shoulders, but I bore it with a strange calm. This was the burden of kingship, to carry steel for others. I knelt then, unhelmed, bareheaded, before a small wooden crucifix affixed to a tent pole. The ground beneath my knees was cold, but I did not move. I thought of my father, Henry of Bolingbroke, and the uneasy crown I had inherited. Of the lives I now commanded. Of God, and what he would ask of me this day. The hours passed in thought. I reviewed the campaign from Harfleur to here, a trail of sickness and exhaustion, of valour and despair. I thought of the men who had died from dysentery, who would never see England again. I carried them, each of them, like stones inside me. Then, as dawn crept near, I stood and drew back the flap of my tent. A breath of morning air, sharp and clean, swept into the space. I inhaled deeply. Today I would lead. Today I would not falter, and whatever else came, I would be ready. Chapter 2. A King's Vigil. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the clouds, I stepped beyond the warmth of my tent into the morning chill. A low fog curled along the edges of the camp, muffling sound and softening outlines. The smoke from scattered campfires hung close to the earth, giving the entire field a ghostly hue. It was as if the world held its breath with us. The banners above my tent, England's lions and St. George's cross, stirred gently in the cold air. I walked slowly, deliberately, through the rows of tents. Few spoke. Most moved in silence, weighed down not by weariness, but by the knowledge of what this day would bring. My boots crunched softly over frost-hardened ground. Archers rubbed warmth into their fingers, their breath misting as they chewed hard bread or salted meat. Some knelt with rosaries, lips moving silently. Others stared at the distant tree line with grim anticipation. These were not men hungry for glory. They were men who had marched 100 miles through mud, disease, and fear, and who had chosen to stand. I paused at a small fire where 5 men huddled. One, barely more than a boy, straightened in surprise. I crouched beside them. "Eat what you can," I said quietly. "You'll need your strength." They nodded, eyes wide. No fanfare followed me here. I was not a distant monarch atop a hill. I was the man who would stand with them, shoulder to shoulder. As I rose and moved on, I saw Sir Thomas Erpingham walking the line of archers, his voice low and firm as he checked formations and gave words of encouragement. Behind him, squires carried bundles of arrows wrapped in cloth, laying them in neat piles behind the stakes each archer had driven into the earth. The stake store, sharpened points angled outward, would stop any cavalry foolish enough to charge our lines. They were our teeth, set into the mud of France. They would hold. Toward the heart of the camp, a chaplain had erected a simple altar on a flat rock. Already a few men had gathered, heads bowed, as he began the Mass of St. Crispin. His voice, though soft, carried in the stillness, Domine, non sum dignus. I stopped at the edge of the circle, removed my gloves, and knelt. The Latin liturgy was familiar and solemn, each word an anchor in the storm of doubt and dread. I bowed my head as the priest raised the host. "Forgive me, Lord," I prayed silently, "for pride, for wrath, for the lives I will take this day." As I stood once more, the fog began to lift, curling away like a departing spirit. The outlines of the distant woods sharpened, and I could feel the approach of the hour. Men began to gather their arms in earnest. Armor was strapped, helms polished, swords buckled on with finality. I passed among them, not as a figure of awe, but as a man they could believe in. I met their eyes, one by one. I offered nothing false, only the truth and the strength we would share. We were not many, but we were enough. And the sun, pale and silver, began at last to rise. Chapter 3. Steel and Strategy. By the time the sun was fully risen, the camp was alive with motion. Men bustled between tents, squires tightened straps and adjusted helms, and captains huddled with their retinues, murmuring last instructions. The hush of the early morning had given way to a focused energia, kind of sacred momentum. At the center of this orchestration, I gathered with my senior captains beneath a canvas awning strung between two spears. The ground beneath us was soft with mud, and the tablet crude slab of wood atop barrels groaned under the weight of a campaign map. York was already there, leaning heavily on the table, eyes narrowed at the contours of the land. Camoys arrived shortly after, his face lined and thoughtful. Erpingham, ever stalwart, carried with him a sense of grave assurance. We greeted each other with nods and brief words, as men do who have shared many long campaigns. Spread before us was the narrow strip of land that would decide our fate. Flanked on both sides by dense woods, the field was little more than a muddy corridor, choked with rain and churned soil. The French had the numbers, yes, but the terrain favoured the disciplined and the patient. They'll try to use the width, Erpingham said, tapping a gloved finger along the map's edges. But their knights will bottleneck here. Camoys grunted. The mud will bog them down. That's our ally, more loyal than any king. I listened, absorbing every word. I had learned early to heed the counsel of experienced men, and I had chosen these commanders not for their names, but for their judgment. Still, the final decision lay with me. We stake the ground again, I said. Archers to the wings. 5 paces deep. Their stakes go down by noon. Same placement as at Shrewsbury? York asked. Yes, I said. Let them ride into our forest of ash and iron. I gave the order for all men to eat, rest where they could, and see to their prayers. Rations of bread, cheese, and dried meat were distributed. Water skins were refilled, and wounds from days past were bandaged again. We had no luxuries to offer, but we had resolve. When the meeting ended, I remained for a moment behind, staring at the map as the others departed. I could feel the battle taking shape in my mind. The pressure of cavalry against the left, the possibility of flanking from the woods, the timing of the archers' volleys. All of it lived in the space between thought and breath. The stillness was broken by York, who had lingered. He stepped beside me, arms folded. "Do you believe we'll live through this?" he asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. "Then that is not what matters. What matters is how we carry ourselves through it." He nodded once, then clapped my shoulder and left me to my thoughts. I folded the map carefully, reverently. We were outnumbered. We were exhausted. And yet, in my heart, I felt something stir. Not confidence, not even hope, but conviction. We had come too far to turn back. The field awaited us. Chapter 4. Words in the Wind. I moved through the camp as the final preparations took hold. 1,000 small rituals played out in quiet succession, last adjustments to gear, whispered prayers, the solemn buckling of belts and bindings. The sounds of war, subdued yet steady, carried through the morning. The rasp of whetstones on blades, the creak of stretched bowstrings, the occasional soft snort of a restless horse. I passed between rows of archers, their faces grim but calm. These were not the pampered knights of courtly fable. They were yeomen broad-backed, and weathered who had slept in ditches and marched through filth. Their strength was in their endurance, their faith in the arc of the longbow and the bonds between brothers. One man carved a crude cross into the butt of his arrow with the tip of a dagger. Another kissed a lock of hair tied around his wrist. I said nothing, only paused to meet their gaze. to lend a presence that spoke louder than any speech. Sir Thomas Erpingham rode past, his eyes scanning the ranks. He dismounted and walked among the men, his voice low but firm. "Keep your stakes braced. Fire high and fast. Wait for my signal." I came upon a small group gathered around a tattered banner of St. George. A chaplain, younger than I expected, led them in a prayer for strength and mercy. They sang a single verse of a hymn I recalled from childhood, and for a moment the wind seemed to still. Further along, a soldier adjusted his breastplate with trembling hands. I stopped and steadied him. He looked up, startled. "What's your name?" I asked. "Edward, my liege, of Norwich." "You are brave, Edward. Bravery is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of it." He nodded, eyes glassy, and I moved on. I knew I could not reassure them all, but in those moments of contact, I could remind them they were not forgotten. From the ridge, I could see the open field beyond, already churned by scouting hooves. The French banners began to appear in the distance, bright silks rippling in the wind, the glint of sunlight off polished helms. They had come in force. Heavy cavalry, formations deep and wide, a display of might. But I saw weakness too, pride, overconfidence, a belief that we, weary and undersupplied, would fold. As the wind rose, I turned into it and closed my eyes for a moment. I let it wash over me, as if it could carry away the burden that lay on my shoulders. My thoughts turned to my brothers Young and Humphrey far from this field, to my friends, to the men who had followed me not for gold, but for loyalty, to the kingdom I bore on my back, and to the moment soon to come, when steel would meet flesh, and history would draw its breath. We were ready, and I would be among them, not above them. Chapter 5, Final Hour. The final preparations had been made. Every man stood in place. Arrows lay in neat bundles behind sharpened stakes. The men-at-arms adjusted their visors and tightened their grips. The low murmur of voices had faded, replaced by a taut stillness that seemed to stretch across the ranks like a drawn bowstring. I stood at the centre, beneath my standard, the lions of England unfurling in the breeze. My armour was plain and worn. The visor of my helm was raised. I wanted them to see my face. I looked down the lines. To the left, the archers stood, many barefoot in the mud to better grip the earth. Some wore nothing more than leathered jacks, but each held a long bow, as tall as himself, strung and ready. To the right, the men-at-arms steel-clad, silent waited with stoic resolve. Their eyes met mine with unwavering trust. I raised my voice not to rally with pomp, but to speak plainly from the heart. "You know what lies before us," I began. "You've seen their numbers, you've heard their boasts, but you also know your own strength. You've walked farther than they would dare. You've fought harder than they ever have. You are not outnumbered. You are unmatched." A few voices shouted in agreement, but mostly they listened, quiet and still. I took a step forward. "We are not thieves or conquerors. We are sons of England. We stand not for glory, but for duty to each other, to those we left behind, to the country that bore us." I paused, then lowered my voice. "There are men here who will not see the dusk. I will not lie to you. But know this, each moment you stand on this field, you carve your name into the heart of history. You become more than a soldier. you become legend. I turned to Sir Thomas Erpingham and gave the nod. He raised his baton. "All archers ready!" he called, his voice carrying down the line. Bows rose in unison, a rustling like dry leaves. The French army began its advance. Their banners, bright as stained glass, approached with slow grandeur. The earth trembled faintly beneath the hooves of their cavalry. A deep horn echoed from their side of the field. I closed my visor. The light dimmed, narrowing to a slit of sky and steel. All sound became distant, muffled by the weight of the helm. Only the pounding of my heart remained. One more breath, one more heartbeat. I raised my sword high. Now, in the name of God and St. George, advance. Chapter 6. The moment before. Time seemed to still. The battlefield ahead, once a quiet canvas of mud and mist, now bristled with movement. French banners moved like thunderclouds across the far tree line. I sat tall in my saddle, the plume on my helm trembling in the breeze, my sword lowered once more, but ready. I could feel the breath of my horse rise and fall beneath me. He was a loyal beast, steady even in the face of chaos. I leaned forward slightly, placing a hand on his neck. "Steady, old friend," I murmured. "You and I have one more duty to see through." The archers were tense, but poised. They knew the signal would come soon. Their fingers gripped bowstrings, their eyes fixed on the narrowing distance. The long wooden stakes before them bristled like teeth. Behind, the men-at-arms lowered visors, murmuring final words to comrades or to God. From this vantage, I could see the French mass forming, rows upon rows of knights with polished lances, banners embroidered in gold, war-horses armored and snorting. They advanced with ceremony, with arrogance. But I saw the weight of their armor sink in the sodden earth. I saw how slowly they came. The wind blew cold against my face through the slits of my visor, and with it came voices distant, indistinct cries from my men, hymns still half sung, the sharp call of a horn. I breathed slowly. In that breath, I saw every step that had led me here. My youth spent behind royal walls, the bloodshed at Harfleur, the dysentery and starvation on the march, the doubt of nobles, the prayers of common men. All of it braided into this one moment. I thought of England, not the throne, but the land, the hills, the fields, the belles of London, the children who would never know the names of these men, but would live free because of them. I whispered into the helm, "Saints preserve us." And then I lowered my visor fully, sealing myself in steel. I became less a man and more a singular banner come alive. The signal came, and with a roar from the throat of England, we surged forward into the mouth of history. The battle had begun.